Okay, everyone. Thanks again for attending today's webinar. This is Craig Ebert, President of the Climate Action Reserve. I think we've got good visual and audio connections with everyone. We have done a number of double checks on the audio, and from what we can tell, everyone is receiving the audio. One strange recommendation is, and I guess we'll type that perhaps into the answers, but if anybody's having any audio difficulty and you're using a headset, just try unplugging and plugging it back in. I have no idea why that might work, but it has worked for some people. But we'll assume that from the looks of those in attendance that everyone is hearing our audio. So again, thank you very much for joining today. If you haven't already done so, everyone is on mute. If there are any questions that someone has, just in terms of housekeeping here, down in the lower right, you should see a Q&A box. Feel free to type in your questions. And our plan is to address the questions at the tail end of the webinar, but if obviously anything comes up regarding the logistics or audio or video quality, we'll try to handle that immediately. So again, let's get started here. I want to thank, on behalf of the governments of Ontario and Quebec, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. This webinar is to discuss the project Adapting Offset Protocols for Ontario, Quebec, and other jurisdictions. I know many of you have been well aware of this project for some time, and this particular webinar today is the kickoff webinar for that project, and I'd love to go into some details for everyone today on the overall design of the project, the schedule, and how we intend to be working with everyone in the coming months. So without further ado, let's get started here. The agenda for today's webinar is going to cover the overall objective of the project, the basic approach we're going to take to adapting the protocols, the key elements of our approach, the basic steps of the work plan, our schedule, give everyone an overview of the technical team supporting Ontario and Quebec, and to the extent that time allows, we'll handle as many questions as we can. I did want to let everyone know that we will be recording this webinar and making the slides available on the Climate Action Reserve's website shortly after this webinar. In addition, we will be doing a second webinar next month, and I'll provide more detail on that at the end of this slide presentation. So first of all, this particular project is intended to adapt 13 protocols for use in Ontario, Quebec, and potentially other Canadian jurisdictions. And I want to be very clear on a couple of key takeaways from there. One, our assignment is limited to the 13 protocols that you're about to see. And secondly, our major focus here is on adapting from existing protocols. That's a key distinction. We're not intending to start over from ground zero to design new protocols. The emphasis is on adapting from existing offset protocols that are available in the market, and I'll touch further on that very shortly. First of all, there are what we're calling 3 priority protocols for this project: landfill gas capture and destruction, mine methane capture and destruction, and ozone depleting substances capture and destruction. Those 3 are referred to as priority protocols because they are essentially substantively as far along as any of the protocols out there. That is, we believe that we can very quickly adapt those 3 protocols for use in Ontario and Quebec and get those to market sooner rather than later. That is the main reason why they've been labeled the priority protocols. In addition, there are going to be 10 other protocols that we're going to include nitrous oxide reductions from fertilizer management, emission reductions from livestock, organic waste digestion, organic waste management, forest projects including reforestation, avoided conversion and improved forest management, afforestation, urban forest projects, grasslands, conservation cropping, and refrigeration systems. So again, those are the 13 protocols that we'll be adapting over the course of the project. What are the main protocols we're going to consider? Well, first of all, our initial efforts under this project are going to be to design let me call it a master list of potential protocols to be adaptive. That will start with a review of current California and Quebec protocols in use under the Western Climate Initiative, plus other registry protocols that have either been adopted or in the process of being adopted. In addition, we're going to do a global scan that's going to include a review of various protocols and methodologies from other programs, including Alberta Specified Gas Emitters Regulation, the British Columbia Emission Offset Regulation, the protocols created by Canada's National Offset Quantification Team in various government departments, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and Clean Development Mechanism. Let me just say our initial objective is to make sure that we have all key qualified candidate protocols identified from the outset in order to determine our starting point and how to move forward from there. Once we have that list, the intent is to narrow down that list to an acceptable list of, for example, 2 to 3 candidate protocols, where we'll be evaluating each of those protocols against WCI criteria that are defined in the document WCI Offset System Essential Elements Final Recommendations paper. This is a document that's posted on the WCI Inc. website and is readily available to the public at large. The goal here, again, is to have protocols adapted that are consistent with protocols already in use within the WCI network. The key criteria to be used for these offset protocols are listed on slide 6 here, and include clearly making sure that they're real in the sense that the reductions are additional, quantifiable, and we're able to account for any linkage. Also, that they are specifically additional, that is, there are reductions that occur beyond business as usual activities, that they're permanent, that is, that we can count on those reductions, those emissions staying out of the atmosphere permanently, that we can quantify what those permanent reductions are. From a legal standpoint, that we can track clear ownership of those reductions. We can verify everything that's happened, and of course, if need be, that the reduction actions are enforceable. So for those of you who have worked in the offset space before, those concepts I think will seem very familiar to you. For others, it might be new, but we intend to make sure that we adapt offset protocols that will lead to very clear, rigorous, and transparent offsets for the cap and trade markets. What will be the approach to adapting the protocols? Well, as I've already mentioned, this project is focused on adapting existing protocols, not developing new protocols. Moreover, the evaluation process that we're going to follow is outlined in the Western Climate Initiative Final Offset Protocol Review and Recommendation process. What are some other key elements of the approach that we will be taking? One is assessing the appropriateness of standardized baselines. One of the key objectives here is to bring to market offset protocols that use a standardized baseline approach. For those of you who may not be familiar with that concept, we want to come up with an establishment of a baseline for each offset protocols that can be readily applied across a number of jurisdictions and a number of different projects using what's called that standardized baseline, as opposed to approaches that some of you may be more familiar with under the Clean Development Mechanism or the joint implementation, where they've often been very project-specific methodologies. And the main rationale for doing that, among others, of course, is to make sure that we've got protocols that can be readily used broadly in the marketplace. So one of the key component of that is that we'll be assuring that those baselines are established using the most stringent regulations that's currently established in the 3 partner jurisdictions, that is Ontario, Quebec, and California. Other key concerns in terms of bringing a valid candidate protocol to market is the availability of previous protocol development documentation. That is, we don't just want to take a protocol off the shelf that has no written and publicly available documentation to it. So that'll be one of the other key concerns that we take to development of offset protocols for this project. As you can see by this webinar today, another very important key element is the inclusion of appropriate stakeholders and Indigenous communities. I'll be talking more about that process very shortly here, but I know that's of keen interest to everyone on the call today. And another key objective is recognize that at the start, we are developing protocols that are applicable in Ontario and Quebec, but we also want to make these protocols, to the extent possible, applicable in the rest of Canada. So that in moving forward, we'll essentially be developing these protocols in a, let me phrase it as a modular format that would highlight for other jurisdictions what sections they may or may not want to update for their own use, but it would be a clear roadmap for their ease of implementation at some point in the future. What I'd like to do now is go over for everyone what the basic steps are in the work plan. There are 18 steps that I want to cover here very briefly. As you'll see, this is essentially a work plan that we plan to implement over a 1-year time frame, and largely these steps are sequential. But it begins, of course, with step number 1, which is the project kickoff. For all practical purposes, let's consider today as that event. Step number 2 is that the consulting team will then begin the initial protocol review to identify the list of possible protocol candidates. As I mentioned earlier, that will essentially involve canvassing potential protocols out there, comprising that, let me call it a master list, assessing that list to determine what we think the best of the best are, perhaps coming up with a smaller list of 2 or 3 candidate protocols, and from that, adapting a protocol for development under this project. That work has already begun, but before we can really move that work farther along, step number 3 is that we're going to finalize what we're calling the technical task team composition. There really are going to be 2 major outreach teams that we're working with. The technical task team is going to be a very small working group comprised largely of the consulting staff, which I will introduce to you shortly, individuals assigned by the ministries to help develop the protocols, and the possibility that a few, I will emphasize the word few, subject matter experts will be approved by Quebec and Ontario for participation in the technical task teams. Let me be very clear that there are ultimately, sorry about that. I don't know if anyone heard that. We just got a major amount of feedback. But while this is one project to adapt offset protocols for use in Ontario and Quebec and other jurisdictions, it may be helpful for everyone to also think about this as being 13 smaller projects, because once each of the 13 protocols that we listed there are underway, each of those protocols will have their own technical task teams working with them. And in addition, there will be a broad stakeholder team, of which I suspect many of you will be participating. So to be very clear, the technical task team is going to be a small working group of, it remains to be seen how large that size will be, but our goal will be to generally keep it small, to keep it as a functional working group. And let me just say around 25 people. That number will vary from one technical task team to the next. And again, as I said, that will be for each of the 13 protocols, so that there will be 13 technical task teams. In addition, for any stakeholder out there who indicates they're interested in a particular protocol, they will be assigned to the stakeholder team to be able to oversee progress on the project as we move forward. So once we get that technical task team composed, the project work will then commence for each protocol. That's step number 4. One of the first assignments for that technical task team will do a detailed review of the available protocols, including any additional research that might be required to convince ourselves that we have a good starting list of candidate protocols. And ultimately, as I indicated, the goal is to come up with a very credible, highly qualified list of the best candidate protocols for adaptation. That list will be brought to the technical task team for finalization. And by finalization, I mean for recommendations back to the ministries in Quebec and Ontario for their endorsement of the work of the technical task team. And as I said, that initial work will involve up to 2 to 3 protocol candidates to make the short list. At that point, we intend to have a reach out to each of the stakeholder teams for each protocol via a webinar. And I think this is very important, so let me explain this in more detail. We recognize that there's a large number of individuals out there that are keenly interested in the outcome of this project. And it's our intent to keep you apprised of our progress and our decisions along the way. The way we intend to do that is through a series of webinars for each protocol. For working purposes right now, assume that there are likely to be 3 stakeholder webinars for each protocol. There might be less than that for the 3 priority protocols, but that remains to be seen. But in any event, if you're interested in, for example, in a specific protocol, you should assume that there are likely will be 3 webinars during the course of this project that will go through where we're at with developing a protocol for that particular source category. And the goal of those webinars is to apprise you of progress, and there will be an opportunity for feedback from the larger stakeholder team. So that first webinar, going back to step 7 here, will provide a summary of the work that the technical task team has done up to that point, saying was essentially the starting list of the candidate protocols we had, and here's how we whittled it down to the 2 to 3 candidate protocols. So that's likely to be the focus of the first webinar. Let me just say very clearly that perhaps the focus of these webinars may change as time goes on, because for whatever reasons we may all feel that there's a better agenda for our webinar, but today on December 21st, 2016, that is our intention. We'll then go to step 8, which is to provide those recommendations back to Ontario and Quebec to make the final decision on the protocol candidates to be adapted. That selection will be posted for everyone's information. Once that posting is done, we'll then move to step 9, which is the consulting team will draft a preliminary protocol for consideration. That draft protocol will be brought back to the technical task team for their review and advice on whether or not the draft has been formulated correctly. At that stage, we intend to schedule a second webinar for all stakeholders for that draft protocol to be presented to the stakeholder team for your understanding, your review, and feedback. So again, that will be the second of what's likely to be 3 webinars for each protocol. Based on the feedback process at that point, the consulting team will then draft a revised protocol. And essentially, we're going through the same process that we just described. That revised protocol will be brought back to the technical task team for that protocol for their review and comment. Once we're comfortable with that revised protocol, we'll schedule another webinar for the stakeholder team that is all of you who are interested in that protocol and present where we're at that point, including the revised protocol, and again, solicit review and feedback. Based on that, the consulting team will then draft a final protocol. That's step number 15. That draft final protocol will be released for public comment and engagement according to the established processes of each province, including First Nations engagement. During that public review process, we'll then await for whatever feedback we get from that, if it's decided that there are any revisions that need to be made in the draft final protocol, that will be incorporated in step 18 into the final protocol, which will then be submitted back to Ontario and Quebec for their consideration as a compliance protocol in their respective cap and trade programs. So that's a quick overview of the essential elements of the work plan. Just sort of as a way of summary, I just want everyone to understand that this is designed to be a reasonably intensive outreach process to make sure that everyone's well aware of the progress that's being made, the decisions that are being made, and to allow a comment on the process during the course of the project itself. What's the schedule that we're going to follow? I've just put up for you what the proposed initial schedule is, and you'll notice that it's essentially designed as a 12-month schedule. And you may be asking, well, what is month one? Since this webinar today is being treated as the kickoff webinar for the project, and we're obviously getting into the holidays here, we'll be treating January 2017 as the first month of the project. So as you can see from the schedule, the first three protocols are the priority protocols we highlighted: mine methane, ozone depleting substances, and landfill gas. The current schedule plans for staggering the development of the other 10 protocols, as you can see elucidated here. I do want to point out to everyone, though, is that we're not waiting until this month necessarily to get the process going. At least here, speaking on behalf of the consulting team, we've already started to canvass the potential list of candidate protocols and to pull that list together. If we can accelerate the process, that is our goal. I think one of the key challenges that we're all collectively facing is just the number of webinars that will be held for this project. Just to put that in context, not even counting today's webinar, if we hold 3 webinars for each of the 13 protocols, you can do the math, but that's 39 webinars over the course of the next year. That's partly why I mentioned earlier that it's helpful to think of this almost as 13 sub-projects that are part of the overall major project. But there's going to be a lot of activity going on, and it's going to be working somewhat independently from other aspects of it. For example, somebody who's interested in the forestry protocol may not be interested in the fertilizer management protocol. So that's an important consideration to keep in mind. We've also been asked before, is our work limited to these 13 protocols, and are we going to be moving forward with the 13 as defined? Well, first of all, while there are potentially other protocols beyond these 13, this project will not be addressing any additional protocols beyond the categories listed here. However, we do recognize that there may be reasons why we want to reorient the 13 listed here into different categories of protocols. For example, by the forestry protocols as one example, we may combine those under one umbrella as just one idea. Those final decisions have not been made at this point. We are just getting started, but I did want everyone to understand that we're going to take some flexibility to how we move forward on developing the 13 protocols, but we're not going to be expanding the work beyond this current list of 13. So let me take an opportunity here to define for all of you in more detail the various groups that we will be working with on this project. And let me start with the consulting team. This work will be led by the Climate Action Reserve. However, we're fortunate to have the best in class of Canadian offset developers and practitioners on our team, including Brightspot Climate, Viresco Solutions, Green Analytics, CapOp Energy, and EcoRessources. Now, what's going to be the role of each of those groups? Here's essentially the structure of the consulting team. Craig Eber, will be directing this project, as president of the Climate Action Reserve. My immediate management team includes Aaron Schroeder from Brightspot Climate as the assistant project director, and Karen Haugen-Kuzera as our technical coordinator from Viresco Solutions. In addition to that, we have formulated 6 protocol adaptation teams, or PATs. Get used to the acronyms. They'll probably be flying around soon enough. But it's according to the 6 categories that are listed there. And just to put it in the context here, here at the Reserve, Teresa Lang will be heading up the agricultural protocol adaptation teams. Although Karen Haugen-Kuzera is going to, given her extensive expertise in this area, will be leading the development of a number of those protocols as well. On the forestry side, John Nickerson will be leading that. Mine methane, again, is Teresa Lang. Landfill gas is Max Dubison here at the Reserve. Waste diversion is Sammy Osman. And on ODS, it's Max Dubison. Now, those are the key individuals here at the Reserve that will be in charge of those protocol adaptation efforts from the Reserve's perspectives. You'll notice that each of the subcontractors are identified in their area of expertise as well. Frankly, we've already been working together, and we intend to be working as hopefully a close-knit, smooth-functioning team moving forward. I will leave it to all of you to decide whether we were successful on that as the project moves forward, but that is our goal. So again, we're excited to work with this group of individuals and believe that the consulting team stands ready, willing, and able to deliver exactly what's needed for Quebec and Ontario. Here are the various groups involved in the process. Well, first and foremost, it starts with the Ministry Approval Team, which will be comprised of Ontario and Quebec government representatives. They have the ultimate say on the direction of the work and which protocols will get adapted, and ultimately which candidate protocols will be considered for final adoption. There will also be the protocol adaptation teams. That's what I just identified for you. So those protocol adaptation teams will have the lead on each of the protocols. Then there are the technical task teams. As I described earlier, these are intended to be a small group for working group purposes, approximately 25 people. It will comprise, in addition to the protocol adaptation team members, also the ministry representatives from Quebec and Ontario, and a small handful of subject matter experts. Those SMEs will be subject to the approval by the ministry approval team. The stakeholder teams will be much larger than the technical task teams. It's going to basically comprise everyone else who has indicated interest to us in this project. So that will include ministry representatives, other provincial representatives, project developers, verifiers, legal experts, Indigenous representatives, industry, and other potential target groups. Frankly, it will be everyone else who indicates to us that they want to follow the progress on a given protocol. And by the way, let me get back to that process for indicating your interest in a protocol in a minute. Another key group will be the Indigenous communities organizations. There will be First Nation specific webinars and email updates, and continued feedback process back to the Ministry of Environment, Climate Change in Ontario, and Quebec through engagement sessions. And finally, there will be just outreach to the general public via the public posting, typically 30 to 45-day period for the draft final protocols. So those are the key groups that will be involved in this process. You know, what are their roles? I think I've touched on this, but I want to make sure that everyone clearly understands what the roles and responsibilities are. First of all, with the Ministry Approval Team, they are responsible for identifying and approving members of both the technical task teams and the stakeholder teams, providing overall policy and direction for the technical task teams and the protocol adaptation teams, as well as selecting the protocols to be adapted and approving the final protocols. The protocol adaptation teams are composed of members of the consulting team, and it's our job to do the heavy lifting in terms of adapting the selected protocols and incorporating the advice from the TTTs and the stakeholder teams. The technical task teams are responsible for reviewing the full list of the potential protocols, helping us to narrow that down to a short list, providing technical advice back to the protocol adaptation teams during the adaptation process on the selected protocols. There's the stakeholder teams, which are responsible for reviewing and providing feedback on all the work that's been undertaken. The Indigenous communities and organizations will be able to review and provide feedback on the work undertaken by the technical task teams and the stakeholder teams. And of course, the general public is always invited to provide comment on the proceedings, and that will be through a public posting process. So a couple of items in a housekeeping sense moving forward. As I mentioned, we recognize that this kickoff webinar is just before the holidays, and many people may not have been able to attend. We will be repeating this webinar on Wednesday, January 11th, 2017 at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. We'll provide the call-in details on that webinar at a later date. Now, the obvious question is, well, how do I get information on that? Many of you on this call, I know, are well aware that we've been comprising a master list of interested stakeholders, a broad mailing list for the last several weeks, and have already started to reach out to individuals on that mailing list to find out what their interests might be in this project. Let me emphasize that outreach activity is simply designed to, well, really two things. One, make sure that we have as large and as inclusive of a mailing list as we can, so that anybody who's interested in how this project is proceeding and what its development, what it's bringing to market, will have that opportunity to track our progress. And secondly, we need to find out exactly what areas of interest you're in. So the way we're doing that, this is addressed in the second bullet. If you have not received an email from the Climate Action Reserve with information on this webinar, or specifically what we're calling a statement of interest form, we want to hear from you to make sure that you get on that master mailing list. And the way to do that is via that email address below, policy@climateactionreserve.org. Please send us your contact information. What we will do is send back out to you the SOI form, the statement of interest form. Again, the only purpose in sending that back to you is to find out what your areas of interest are and to make sure that you're getting the relevant information. So through this process, it is our goal to have that all-inclusive master mailing list, if you will. So we expect that to keep growing over time. And it is the best way for you to make sure that you're getting the relevant information on not only on the overall project, but also on the individual protocols and what's the progress to date for each of those protocols. At the tail end of the webinar, I'll give you a little bit more information. As I mentioned, we do intend to post this slide deck as well as recording of this webinar on the Climate Action Reserve website. We'll get that to you at the tail end. And there'll be further information forthcoming on how you can stay abreast of the project in addition to individual emails you might receive. But at this point, why don't I open it up for any questions that the audience might have, and we'll go from there. All right, I'm just going to take these questions as best I can, and with the limited time available, we'll try to get through them as much as possible. First question was, will all 13 protocols be given credit in California? Ultimately, that's up to the state of California to decide which protocols they want to adapt. They have their own separate process. I will say that the intent for developing any candidate protocol here is to do so in a format that's consistent with the Western Climate Initiative criteria. But I do want to be very clear that that's not our decision, that's the state of California's. I addressed this earlier, but I think it's important. One question was raised, when considering protocols, will you only consider protocols within the 13 project types, or would you consider others? For instance, British Columbia is publishing a new protocol for carbon capture within concrete. Can this be included? The answer to that is no. At this stage, no, that is not intended at this point. Now, that doesn't mean that at some point in the distant future that Quebec and Ontario might not be interested in that. But let me be very clear, this project is not contemplating adding to the 13 protocols that we've gone over in this webinar. Question 4, will it be necessary to estimate the uncertainty when using standardized baselines? Yes, absolutely. That's part of the development of a standardized baseline, and I'll leave the details of that up to each of the protocol adaptation teams. But that issue is always front and center with development of a standardized baseline. Another question, will the candidate protocols be different than the 13 that have already been identified? Not sure exactly what that question entails, but let me clarify what our intent is. The 13 protocols that we flagged are protocol categories, for lack of a better term. That is, we have not specifically identified a given existing protocol that we're going to adapt. That is the early work of the consulting team and the technical task teams, is to come up with that master list of potential candidate protocols. Those candidate protocols are based on actual protocols that currently exist out there. And our initial work will involve trying to determine what the short list of the best candidates look like. So that's the initial work of the technical task teams. Our goal is not to leave any qualified candidate protocols behind, and we intend to have from that master list an explanation for each of the stakeholder teams as to why a given protocol was one, either considered and rejected and why it was rejected, or two, why it was considered and accepted and why it was accepted. Question, what is the basis for having the 3 priorities, mine, methane, ODS, and landfill gas? Good question. Again, as I said earlier, the main rationale for flagging those 3 categories first is the belief that those protocols are much further along for finalization for Ontario and Quebec than the other categories. Obviously, we're going to test that out when we get our project work underway, but the assumption was that those 3 protocol categories could be most quickly adapted and brought to market. That's the only reason that they're listed first. As I said, we'll find out whether that's indeed the case. we have a question on, can you identify the source of funding for this project? I will simply explain from, the Climate Action Reserve has a contract with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change in Ontario. They are working jointly with Quebec on this. It has since come to my attention, long after we submitted our proposal, that actually Minister Glenn Murray was explaining this to me, that this apparently is the first time that Quebec and Ontario have jointly cooperated on procuring services together in the entire history of the two provinces. Some of you may know that history better than I'm sure you do, but I will take Minister Murray at his word, and we're honored to be in that position. We're looking forward to that collaboration. It's going to be a lot of fun. We have a very important question here. Is this presentation available in French? Yes, it is. Quebec has been translating this slide deck and will be, in addition to us posting it on our website, Quebec will be posting the French version on their website. More information to come on that. We're still working out the details of the communication protocols out to all of you. But as I said earlier, it is our keen desire and interest here in making sure that you're all kept abreast of the pace of each project for each protocol. And we'll be doing that through a combination of information posted either here at the Reserve and or on each of the ministry websites. All those details have not yet been worked out, but we'll clearly get that information to you as soon as it's readily available. Question on when will the offset registry be launched and how long will it take to register offset projects? We really do not have an answer to that question at this stage of the game. That is, I think, part of the challenge for each province to consider is exactly how they want to register offset projects, when they want to do so, and how to bring that to market. So there may be further information available on that question at a later date, but at the moment, there's no specific information I can offer on that one. Another question, if someone has already sent in a statement of interest form, when would they expect to be contacted regarding participation? Great question. We're already working on compiling both the technical task teams and the stakeholder teams. If you've already sent in that statement of interest form, we already know which protocols you're interested in. So you should assume that you're already on that stakeholder team. And as soon as we start, get to the point where we have information to send to you, we'll do so. So you're already on our mailing list. Again, that's the whole purpose behind that statement of interest form, that not only are we comprising a master mailing list, if you will, but we're also comprising a mailing list for each of the protocol categories. So if you've indicated to us that you have an interest in a given protocol type, we're marking that down and putting you on the mailing list, the email list, if you will, for that protocol. Another question, what is the process going to be for entirely new protocols that are not part of the study? I know this question's come up before, but I know there's also keen interest out there on that. We have no further information at this time. And again, I can't emphasize enough that this particular project, that these 13 protocol categories have been identified as the more important areas to get started in. It doesn't necessarily mean that Ontario and Quebec or other provinces may not undertake other offsets at some point, but we are not going to be doing that as part of this project. Question, is the plan to post all 13 protocols for public consultation in Ontario over the next year or so? First of all, they will be posted by both Quebec and Ontario, and they will be posted for each protocol whenever we get to that point in the process. So to the extent that we're intending to complete this over the next year, that is our initial goal, is to post those publicly for each and every protocol. We'll have to see how the timeline is or is not affected by the actual pace of work over the next year, but that is our goal right now, is to bring all 13 to market, including the public consultation and comment over that time period. Great question here. Is forestry to include forest lands owned / controlled / managed by First Nations? No decision has been made on that issue at this point. That will be a matter of discussion with First Nations, and we'll provide subsequent updates on that once those discussions have happened. But those discussions have not even begun, so we'll have to table that question for now. Question, do you know when the technical task team members will be invited to the teams? Let me be clear on that. We intend to comprise those teams over the next several weeks, because they're very critical to getting our work started. But I also want to caution anyone from expecting a contact to be added to the technical task teams. Why? As I said earlier, the main composition of the technical task teams is going to be the consulting team and the representatives recommended by the ministries. There will be a small number of subject matter experts in addition to those two categories to comprise the technical task teams, but unquestionably, most of you are going to be part of the stakeholder teams. And I don't want to get expectations up that a lot of you are going to be getting invitations to the technical task teams. That would quickly lead to a very large number of members on that technical task team. So there's not a set schedule, as you saw from the individual schedule for each protocol. We're rolling out the 13 protocols at a different pace. So there's obviously greater urgency for the 3 priority protocols to get those technical task teams comprised earlier rather than later. So that'll be a bit of a rolling process, and it will vary by protocol, but that will be one of our first orders of action, if you will, and we'll be undertaking that right now, as a matter of fact. Question, you mentioned a modular approach to the protocols. Do you envision, for example, that protocols would have different modules for different provinces, allowing unique standardized baselines for each provinces? Potentially, yes. The goal here is to adapt protocols primarily at this point for use in Ontario and Quebec, but each of the technical task teams will be responsible for identifying the sections of each recommended protocol that could be readily adapted by other provinces. That will include, obviously, the standardized baseline. For example, if another province sometime in the future decides it does not like the definition of a standardized baseline in whatever is accepted from this project, they will have the option to modify that. But again, we're all peering into our foggy crystal balls here. If and when other provinces take that on and what areas they feel strongly about adapting to their own circumstances, that will be for them to decide. Okay, just going through the question list here. For the ODS destruction protocol, will the team consider adapting the protocol to expand the list of eligible ODS refrigerant types, given that the current eligible types are almost completely phased out and are being collected in low levels in Canada? That is a question that will go before the technical task team on ODS, and I will not hazard a guess on how they will come down on that question at this point. would landfill gas projects occurring in jurisdictions that already have regulations for landfill gas capture and destruction qualify as an offset? Without knowing more details about that question, it's hard to answer that. Clearly, if a jurisdiction has a regulation on the books that requires a certain amount of landfill gas capture, one will not be able to generate offsets from that. And given the what we're calling sort of the jurisdictional additionality across all the participating jurisdictions, if one jurisdictions, i.e. California, Quebec, or Ontario, have a law in the books that says that requires certain actions, that I would expect is going to lead to an exclusion of that activity from consideration as offsets. But again, that will be subject to further consideration by the technical task teams. And before I go on, let me just said this at the outset, but I'll offer this caveat right now. The answers I'm providing are mine alone. I have not run these answers by the ministries for their review and approval. If there's any corrections or additions to the answers I'm providing, we will get that to all of you at a later date. But please take everything I'm saying at this stage of the game, since it is the kickoff webinar, with a word of caution, because we've got a lot of moving parts to get this project working smoothly, and the terms of the engagement and how we interact may change moving forward. Another question: how is the joint procurement of the two relevant provinces being handled? Does each have a veto? Is either the lead on any or all protocols? I'm going to read that question and then not answer it at all, except to tell you, at this point, Quebec and Ontario have been working jointly together. I expect that to continue. Our objectives here are to come out with products that are satisfactory for both provinces. Contractually, we have a contract with Ontario, but that does not override the clear objective of this project, which is to have working, viable, nimble protocols for both jurisdictions, as well as other Canadian provinces. So I'll stop there before I get into trouble. Has it been decided that all protocols developed will use a standardized baseline approach? Is there the option to have some protocols be standardized baseline while other protocols be project-specific baselines? Initial answer to that is no, that we intend to follow the standardized baseline approach across the board. Now, the only caveat I will add to that is that each of the technical task teams in the course of their deliberations may come up with some rationale that we haven't yet realized that may argue for some other considerations. But the objective from the start here is to use standardized baseline approach. That is the approach that has been taken with the current jurisdictions, and it's the approach we intend to foster moving forward. Has the forest team anticipated how many different standardized baseline zones will be included in the forest protocol? Will protocols include baselines for the whole country, or create a path for project developer or the province to evidence baselines for the region? Great question. That is a question that will be posed to the technical task teams for forestry. They will need to figure out the answers to that. How much time will be given to the stakeholder teams to review and provide feedback on the technical details of the protocols? At this time, I do not have an answer to that. It will be a relatively short time, only because we have to keep this process moving. But we certainly also want to make sure it's at least enough time to understand the progress that has been made, and to give them an opportunity to to respond. But stay tuned for further information on that front. Will adapted protocols need to be approved by California as well as by Ontario and Quebec? That decision is up to each and every jurisdiction to decide what they are going to approve or not going to approve. It is possible that one jurisdiction may have more approved protocols than another, and that's their prerogative. Since the cap-and-trade system will permit offset types from anywhere in Canada, will protocols be tailored to the conditions in different parts of the country as well as Quebec and Ontario? That question, I'm just going to challenge the premise because there has not necessarily been a final decision made on whether offset projects will or will not be valid across Canada. And let me be very clear about that. I'm not saying there will not be. I'm just saying that we haven't even started the project and had that discussion. So some of you may have more information from your discussions of what directions each province intends to go, but I do not want to state at this time what that direction might be. Is it possible that one or more of the 13 protocols on the list cannot meet the WCI standards and be dropped from the process? I think the answer to that is yes, it's possible. We're not anticipating that as an outcome, but it will be part of the technical task team deliberations to assess whether or not a protocol type can meet the WCI standards. Excuse me, I'm just reading through some of the other questions here. I understand that covered industries are not eligible for offset projects. I would expect mines to be covered, so why is mine methane being considered? Wouldn't mine methane destruction be a way for the mines to reduce their GHGs below their allowances? Part of that question will have to be tackled by that protocol adaptation team. It is a good question, and it's all wrapped up in determining what's the standardized baseline and what is determined to be additionality, as well as some of the other criteria. I think we've got time for one more question. If there are multiple individuals at one company that would like to participate, should each complete the statement of interest form? Ultimately, that is up to you to decide. We are happy to add all the individuals you would like to the mailing list so that they get any updated information. But in order for us to do so, we would need to receive the contact information for all the individuals that you want to receive any upcoming forms of communication. So again, I think the ball is in your court to decide whether that's appropriate or not. But if you do decide that you want to move forward with that, by all means, send us the information. Actually, it's just time for one other question here. For the Climate Action Reserve General Policy Mailing List, are those who have submitted statement of interest forms included in that general list? Or do we have to contact you separately to be included on the policy list? You should include us separately. We do not plan for anyone who's on our mailing list just to send them out general information on this project. It may come out via our newsletter, but if you have any interest specifically on any of the individual protocols, it's important that we receive your statement of interest form. And let me be very, very clear on that. It partly goes back to what I was saying earlier about the fact that this is really almost 13 small projects as part of a larger whole. If you want to track progress on any of the individual protocols, we need you to send us your contact information so we can add you to that mailing list. anyone on our general mailing list, we're not going to have any idea what protocols of interest are of interest to you, so you will have to provide that data to us. I realize that we are through the process here. I did want to provide some key information here. And again, for those of you interested in receiving further information and have not already sent us your statement of interest form, again, just under my name there is policy@climateactionreserve.org. Send us your contact information. And again, we are going to post this webinar slide deck on the Climate Action Reserve website. We will also post the recording of this webinar. And in addition, we'll be holding this webinar again on Wednesday, January 11th, and there will be further details to come from us on the call-in information for that webinar. So, come to the close of this webinar. I want to thank everyone for participating. Really do appreciate it. Have a fabulous holiday season, and we'll see everyone after the start of the year. Take care.